Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we're going to talk about dark flesh tone, non-Caucasian flesh tone or African flesh tone, however you want to think about it. And well, you'll notice our friendly ogre here from some previous tutorial videos. So let's talk about what we've done so far, because it's very simple. He was zenithal highlighted, as you know from previous videos, and I took a thin layer of Vallejo Game Air dark flesh tone, and lots of different lines make a dark flesh tone. Thinned it down and just ran it over there so we can use some of the zenithal to our advantage. We can see how it's lighter up here than underneath, those kinds of things. We're just using a thin layer to get our use the zenithal to our advantage. And I like these ogre models because they have great musculature, and you can really see the difference in what we're going to do. So let's talk about what we're aiming at, which is going to be something like this guy. Here's our little Excelsior War Priest. You can see how he came out. And what are we using to get there? Okay, so I got 5 paints here. Got my original. That one's fairly obvious. For my shadow, I've got some African shadow, perhaps fairly obvious, from scale 75. I've got Dubai Brown, which is a slightly lighter brown. I don't actually like using lighter browns. This is actually fairly close. You can see there, it's fairly close. I don't like highlighting dark flesh with lighter browns because it just doesn't actually capture how light is playing with darker flesh tones. So for our actual highlight colors, we have Kalahari Orange and Basic Flesh Tone, or Caucasian Flesh. In scale 75, which calls it Basic Flesh, which is what we generally want to use, something like this. Now you're probably wondering, why orange? That seems insane. No, I didn't lose my mind. All flesh tone, as I've discussed previously, is somehow related to orange. And usually with Caucasian flesh tone, it's just orange with a fair amount of white mixed in, is how we get to something like this. A lot of people who paint on canvas and such mix their own flesh tones, and they do it from red and yellow, and then they mix in white to that and add little bits of blue to create shadow and stuff like that. We're not going to go through all that, but we are going to use these two, and we're going to use the orange to bring life back into this brown, because one of the problems with brown flesh tones is that they're often kind of dead. Like, if you look at people's flesh tone, like mine for example, look at my knuckles. You see all the red and stuff in there, the blood? We're going to use this orange to bring some of that blood back in there. Okay? Alright. So, Mr. Ogre. Now, how do you do this if you want to go fast method? To start out, I'm going to sketch in some shadows like I normally do. So I'm going to take some of my African shadow here, thin amount of it. You can see on my back of my thumb there. And I'm just going to drop some of those shadows in. Now, with darker flesh tone, I actually like to start dark. So what I mean by that, let me be very specific with what I mean by that. I'm starting with almost the darkest color I'm going to have, okay? Because I like building up with dark flesh tone as opposed to shading down a great deal and then and then highlighting. So I'm doing, in other words, think of where you start with your painting. Like, if this is the spectrum of all the colors you're going to use, you often start in the middle, right here, and then you kind of have shade down and you highlight up. In this case, if this is what I'm doing, I'm actually starting like right here, very near the lowest point. I just find that works better for darker flesh tones. Your mileage may vary. If you didn't want to sketch in those colors, what you would do is just, you know, we'd hit him with a wash of, in this case, for darker flesh tones, you could use like an Agrax. You could use an Agrax mixed with a drop of Druchii Violet. That will look really nice. Something like that, and you just wash over. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little mix of my Dubai Brown, my Kalahari Orange, and my Basic Flesh Tone. What's my ratio here with these? Well, it's about 2 of the brown to 1 of the flesh tone and 1 of the orange. Roughly. I mean, there's, you know, I'm doing this on a wet palette, so I'm just kind of blending it until it looks right. What I end up with is something like that. Now what I'm going to do is just kind of start dropping some thin highlights over most of this. And because I'm starting lower, I'm actually, you can see, like, my goal here is to put these highlights on most of the raised areas, right? That is to say, I'm covering over most of what I've done. You can see how thin what I'm doing is. This is one of the reasons I love scale 75 paints, because they just blend, and when they dry, they're so matte, they're so smooth. But I'm covering over, you can see, most of the previous layer. I'm actually using my starter color as sort of the first transition. Now what I do is I just start working in more and more basic flesh tone and using more and more water and thinning it. Okay? So I'm just working into a glaze. Now I'm up to something like that. And the goal here is to just keep glazing slightly less of the miniature. In fact, these are even a little bit thicker than a normal glaze. We're almost layering, and not quite. Now I'm going to bring in just a little bit more of that basic flesh tone and be even thinner. As this goes on, it gets more and more toward a true glaze as we get lighter and lighter. Okay. We didn't let that dry all the way, and that's okay. We can use our finger to just blend that in a little bit. The old finger method, very popular. And I'm focusing on a tiny area of this just because I want to show you quickly. I'm not trying to paint the whole mini. Okay, so you can see how we've gotten up to something like that. And then I'm going to go, and my final highlight here is going to be almost completely basic flesh, just very, very thin. You can see how that barely shows up on my hand. And I'm just dropping it at the highest points. Okay? So now we get something that looks like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to work our life back into this. Okay? We want to smooth all this out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of that orange and a little bit of that purple. I'm going to put them together. Okay? Because what happens is I get a really nice shade. Looks something like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it down. I'm going to glaze over not everything, but darn near everything. I'm going to leave maybe the highest point and my highest highlight. Okay? Now, we want to let that glaze dry completely. Anytime you're doing a true glaze, and that was absolutely a true glaze, nice and thin. But you can see there what happened. Look at how it brought all those tones together. Okay? As that dries, I'm going to talk about how I would sketch this quicker. Obviously, I did a couple different layers there, moving up slowly with the flesh tone. And if I were doing this for like very serious competition or something, I would have done even more. And I would have pushed those highlights up even more. If you're trying to do it quick, because, let's say you've got a bunch of these ogres or chaos warriors or something like that to do, whatever it happens to be, I don't care. You got an army to paint. You don't have time to do maybe like 6 different highlight layers on each thing. Okay, that's fine. Do 2 or something like that, quick, thinner highlights, and then rely on your glazes to bring it back down, because you can just very quickly sketch in these glazes, and you see, look at how nice that evened all that out, right? And that's the beauty of using this orange with the plum. Now, if you don't have these two, you can create a desaturated orange by taking one of your normal oranges and mixing in a tiny amount of blue. And this is just a dark plum color. You could get this by taking a regular purple and mixing in a little yellow to desaturate it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go back to my original flesh tone and my original purple. That is to say the plum color, the African shadow. So that's very dark. And then I'm going to continue just bringing my shadows back down. And again, this is a thin glaze. But what it lets me do is smooth out. Now remember, I didn't touch the darkest shadows here other than when I initially sketched them in. So this helps me. A little bit too much got in that crack there. There we go. This helps me recreate that. If you're not getting dark enough, or if you want to really push your darker shadows, you can take a little bit of just straight black okay, or something like that, or even something a near black like a gray or something like a German gray. You can bring that into your purple, but you want to be thin with that. Like in fact, you might even just want to use a little Nuln Oil or something in there with that plum color, and we can bring that shadow way down. With something like this ogre, it probably makes sense because he's got these super deep ridges right in his flesh. So I can just sketch those shadows back in very easily. Now, a quick note on different types of miniatures. Okay? When you're painting things like these ogres that have these incredibly defined muscles, like this guy's ridiculous, right? Like look at those that muscle structure. Like that's insanity. When you're painting figures like this that have these like super defined muscle structures, they're going to take to things like washes and stuff like that much better. Okay? When you're painting say a female figure that has much less in the way of by the way, this is just me taking my original midtone and kind of resketching in some of my highlights to smooth things out. You can always keep working. One of the keys to getting like really rich tones of skin is to keep working it up and then work it down. You don't have to go through all that if you don't want to. This is just my own personal sort of feelings. But at any rate, when you're working with models that have less, I don't know, ridges, I guess, for lack of a better term, you want to make sure that, excuse me, you can rely on washes a lot less. Okay? The problem is, washes are meant to catch ridges. When you don't have that, when you don't have those ridges, the wash just doesn't go anywhere. The wash just has nowhere to collect. So on a very flat skin tone, you have to rely on the wash less, and you have to kind of rely on your highlights more and some more placed thin glazed shadows. But at any rate, if you're dealing with big muscly dudes, you know, you got some warriors of corn out there or something, well, then you can probably rely on washes much more. But you can see here what happens as I just quickly keep glazing in these highlights and then working it up, right? And that's what we want to do. With flesh, it's about tonal variation, okay? So by just doing these light glazes back and forth to our highest highs and then back to our lowest lows, and we keep using that mixture of the purple and orange to smooth everything out and keep the figure alive. Those little tones just help breathe that life back into the miniature. You can see there, we've got a wonderful, wonderful, really nice, warm, dark flesh tone, okay? Feels very alive. Still got some nice shadows sketched in, and the key is do this as many times as you think is necessary. I can't tell you how many times is right, but you know how much is right for your miniature. The quickest version of this, if you're just trying to paint an army, is probably you get the brown over your zenithal, a thinned layer, and then you sketch in 2 highlights, and then you do a quick glaze of, say, you know, these 2, the purple and orange, and then you maybe 1 dark shadow glaze. Maybe not even that. Okay? If you don't have that, if you know, have more time to spend on the individual figure, you figure the level out that's right for you. I can't tell you the amount of time you need to invest in a fig. There is no right amount. There's the right amount for you with your figure. Okay? So, I basically think that guy is going to be, you know, he feels pretty good for right there. So we'll call it right there. Because everything else from this point is just me repeating the same process. Keep building in the shadows, building up your highlights. So there you go. That's your dark flesh tone. Remember your keys here with your dark flesh tone. Thin glaze of your original brown over your zenithal to use your lights and shadows. Your purple, and maybe purple mixed with a very dark German gray for your shadows. Keep those thin. Keep those only, you know, on the recesses. The more ridges in the model, the more you can rely on things like washes and stuff like that. and you want to use some kind of orange or red, like you could replace this with maybe a Reichland flesh shade or something, mixed with your basic flesh to create your highlights, and use thin glazes of this to bring it back down. So, there you go. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial on dark flesh tone. If you like it, give it a like down there. That's always nice. If you want to share this video, that's always the nicest thing you can do. I really appreciate you sharing these tutorials out with other folks who you think it could help. Subscribe if you want to see more hobby cheating in the future. Leave a comment of a future hobby cheating video you'd like to see. I love taking audience suggestions, and I want to know what you want to see. But as always, I appreciate you watching very much, and we'll see you next time.